So, to build on that concept that there's a lot of political tension around school finance, and that quite often ideology of race and class influences people in their arguments, that many people who have negative racial views about particular communities will argue that money doesn't matter. In other words, we don't need to address the institution, and instead will argue that the values or behaviors of individuals are what cause inequality. So, just to kind of reiterate that backstory before we jump in here, many people consider school finance as a second generation effort to desegregate. It's basically where people moved after it became obvious that physical desegregating of neighborhoods, of schools, was really being resisted strongly, and that the way that desegregation was playing out, as Siddle Walker tells us, was not necessarily the way that African American communities or Latino communities had hoped that it would. So people started focusing on resources as kind of partly an attempt to move desegregation back to its original intentions, but also as a more pragmatic response to the massive resistance to desegregation. In other words, people were thinking, if you're going to isolate our children in these schools, at least let us get the resources there to make it a healthy experience, similar to some of what Du Bois was talking about. So then we start to have these arguments for school finance along lines of adequacy. So adequacy is just kind of the term you'll see in the literature quite a bit if you read about school finance. And what people mean when they say that is they're talking about the minimum amount necessary to provide a, quote, acceptable public education. So you can see even in that definition how political that could be. You know, who gets to decide what's adequate? Who decides what's appropriate? Traditionally, that has usually meant the bare minimum for the basics, like a box to put your student in, a pen, a pencil, paper, and then math reading. So obviously you're not going to get a really rigorous, high quality education if your finance formula relies on a bare minimum attitude. And the other part that makes this approach a little bit more politically acceptable to high spending districts and to wealthier constituents, however, is that this adequacy approach does not address inequalities between districts or schools at all. What it focuses on is getting the people on the bottom the bare minimum they would need to move up a little bit. So it leaves in that inequality of the local tax contribution, but it fills in the gap with state funds. And as we had discussed earlier, that's basically what Wisconsin does, where we fill in the gaps. We don't necessarily say wealthy districts can't tax themselves more. However, we're a little different in the sense that we do cap spending. So usually wealthy districts will push back on that quite a bit, where they want to maintain their ability to spend much more than low spending districts. So that's one way that Wisconsin is different. But, you know, one of the positive things about adequacy, even though it doesn't address inequality across district or across states, is that it does acknowledge that money matters for a quality education. It acknowledges that money influences educational outcomes and that the state has a responsibility to provide those resources. That's an important concession that provides some legal protection for many low-income communities. So this idea that money doesn't matter in student outcome is quite often the crux of ideological debates. And we can see that today in neoliberal kind of market reform conversations of public schools, where people will argue in Waiting for Superman, for example, that it's lazy or disinterested teachers that create the problem, or teacher unions that are creating this problem. It's not that the schools that are being focused on in these conversations are urban schools that have been neglected deliberately for decades. And in that sense, the active resistance to desegregation and the huge inequalities of school finance have created the situation that people are now blaming on teachers. So from that standpoint, you can say that we're ignoring a systemic cause, failure to desegregate, failure to equalize resources, failure to actually have the political will to care about students of color and low-income students. And instead what we're saying is it's an individualized problem. It's just that one population, teachers, who do not step up. Everything about the institution would be fine if we just had more caring teachers. So that argument is undermined when you start pulling out research for adequacy, because the research that supports adequacy shows clearly that money actually does matter. So first I'm going to kind of show how this neoliberal agenda plays out, and then we're going to kind of walk through some of the arguments and show you how that is relevant. So one of the most famous, I guess, scholars for being ideological would be Eric Hanushek. So you can see down here with this example that people from the Cato Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, the Manhattan Institute, those kind of conservative think tanks, they either manipulate or misrepresent data in order to promote a particular political agenda. So in that sense, they're not necessarily adhering to the norms of scholarly behavior, and instead are using research in a manipulative way for a political agenda. And so the political agendas that are connected to this idea that money doesn't matter would be things like, well, basically everything that falls under this neoliberal idea. So neoliberalism basically argues that you can achieve equality through competition and choices. So from that standpoint, you wouldn't want to just infuse resources into a school that's struggling. What you'd want to do is have the students be able to choose to leave that school for something better. So you've individualized that school where you take each student as a person and allow them the choice to go somewhere else. But you're not necessarily creating a safety net for the people who would still be in that building. You've just kind of abandoned that. You're not going to pay more for it. And instead, if you stay there, then you're choosing poorly. And so then it becomes your fault for being in a bad school. So that idea of competition then is you want to have a good school that will attract students. If they all have the right to choose, then you need to work for it. You don't have a captive audience. And so that's supposed to incentivize you to up your game and do your best and attract students to your school. This logic has been proved faulty in a lot of different ways. We'll talk about that later this week when we talk more about neoliberalism. But the point here is that choosing to go to a charter school or choosing a voucher, that's an alternative to finance reform. So rather than infuse money in Milwaukee public schools, for example, our state right now is massively cutting money from the public schools in Milwaukee. And instead, it's shifting that money over to charter schools and to vouchers. So what we're doing is we're using money as a way to steer populations away from public schools and incentivize them to take a private option instead. So this neoliberal agenda and school finance are very much related. If you can starve the public schools through school finance, you make the private options much more attractive to people who are stuck in those schools being bled. All right, so we'll leave it at that. But the important thing to note, which I think most people on a common sense level understand, is that money does matter. At a very basic level, the people who are arguing that money doesn't matter, you have to look at where their kids go to school. A lot of times they're going to very expensive private schools, and so even there you ask, well, if money really doesn't matter, why do you spend so much of it on your child? But in a less anecdotal way, there's research that also shows that money does play a significant role. The two areas that have been consistently found to make the biggest impact on student outcomes are teacher quality and class size. So if you can afford high quality teachers and you can afford to have very small class sizes, those are the two factors that are most likely to produce high results in student outcomes. Okay. So if you're trying to gauge a particular reform and see, did our reform to finance matter, there's a couple things that you want to keep in mind. One, a court-ordered finance reform is usually a lot more effective than something that the legislator just decided. The reason why is because the court is able to kind of cut through the politics of the state legislature, and therefore they're probably going to go a lot further in the equality that would be embedded in the new formula. The other thing then is, how long did the reform last, and how deep did it go? So if you have a reform that was in place for a consistent amount of time and that was being targeted to the right places, then it's very likely that that will make a difference, a positive difference in student experiences and outcomes. So figuring out where the spending is most effective is very important. So as I already mentioned, teacher quality is very important. And part of the way that you ensure teacher quality is by having competitive teacher salaries and supported, sustained opportunities for professional development. The other part of that is having additional support staff. The other parts that have been shown to be effective places to spend your money would be school social services, such as daycares or medical clinics, providing food for students, in updating your facilities, not only in terms of avoiding overcrowding, but also in terms of having up-to-date technology access for all your students. And then the last part would be that increased access to high-level curricula. So all of these different areas are solid places to focus your energy and your resources in order to improve student performance. But social science research, as I had said before, is very political. And so what we're going to do is kind of talk more about that to help you understand how to make good decisions in evaluating research and what kind of role this strong ideological fight has in people's understandings of what a good reform is, what we should focus our energy on in public schools today. So if we go back to the desegregation era, I had mentioned in an earlier video that social science research really started playing a prominent role in court decisions around the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So once we get into the 1960s, it's very acceptable and popular to use social science research to drive policy for public education. Probably the most famous report is called the Coleman Report that came out in 1966. This report had a huge impact on the nature and the direction of public school policy, partly because of how widely it was disseminated in the media and how, therefore, a lot of policymakers were aware of this study, but also because of the way that Coleman packaged his results. So it was a very soundbite friendly reporting of this data, which most people then who are policymakers didn't necessarily read the whole report or have the academic background to analyze its methodology or the validity of its results. Instead, they just had a quick, easy version of research, and since it was research, then it seemed legitimate. So this had a huge impact, and still today people debate the Coleman Report and go back and reevaluate it and discuss it. It's still a very prominent report.